I never believed in fate. I was the kind of woman who believed in alarm clocks and spreadsheets, in deadlines and quarterly reports, and the kind of life you could plan and predict and control. I was Sophia Reyes, 32 years old, senior architect at Blackwell and Associates, and I had everything exactly where I wanted it. My apartment was on the 14th floor of a building that overlooked the city. My coffee was always the same blend, ordered from the same shop every morning at 7:15. My life was structured, clean, and entirely mine. And then one rainy Tuesday in October, Elena Vasquez walked through the glass doors of our office, shook the water from her dark umbrella, looked up with those deep brown eyes, and smiled at the receptionist like she had just arrived somewhere she had always belonged. I watched her from across the lobby. I was holding a folder of blueprints I had been staring at for 20 minutes without actually seeing. She was wearing a rust-colored coat that was slightly too big for her, her dark curly hair damp at the edges from the rain, and she was laughing at something the receptionist had said. Her laugh was genuine and warm and entirely unself-conscious, and it moved through the marble lobby like a song. I told myself I was simply noticing a new employee. This was reasonable. This was professional awareness. I went back upstairs and did not think about her for approximately 4 minutes. She was the new interior design consultant our firm had brought on for the Harmon project, a massive renovation of a historic hotel in the center of the city. I found this out from my colleague Marcus, who told me with the kind of casual indifference that made me want to press him for every single detail without appearing to press him for every single detail. "She is supposed to be brilliant," Marcus said, scrolling through his phone. "Won a major award in Barcelona last year. They're saying she has an eye for spaces that most people cannot explain." "Great," I said, in the voice of someone who had not been thinking about her laugh. For the better part of a morning, I met her properly at the project briefing 2 days later. There were 8 of us around the long conference table. She sat across from me and to the left, which meant I had to be careful about where I looked, because every time my eyes moved in her direction, they seemed to want to stay there. She spoke about the Harmon project with a kind of passionate precision I had rarely seen. She talked about the original architecture of the building, about the conversation between old bones and new purpose, about how a space could hold memory and still welcome the future. She used her hands when she talked. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow. Her voice had a slight accent I could not place, something that moved through her words like a current beneath water. When the meeting ended and people began gathering their things, she looked directly at me and said, "You are the lead architect, yes, Sophia?" "Yes," I said. "Your work on the Callaway building is extraordinary. The way you handled the light on the north facade. I studied it for an entire afternoon when I first came to the city. I had spent 2 years on the Callaway building, hundreds of hours thinking about that north facade. Almost no one outside of architecture circles had ever mentioned it to me, let alone told me they had studied it." "Thank you," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Your work in Barcelona, the renovation of the textile factory. I read about it in a journal 2 years ago, and I have been thinking about it ever since." She smiled slowly, like sunrise. "Then perhaps we will think well together." She turned and walked out of the conference room, and I stood there holding my notebook and understood, with a clarity that was entirely inconvenient, that something in my carefully structured life had just shifted on its axis. We began working together every day. The Harmon project was enormous and complicated and required constant collaboration between architecture and design, which meant that Elena and I were in each other's orbit from 9 in the morning until often 7 or 8 at night. We spread plans across large tables. We argued productively and respectfully about sightlines and materials and the way natural light would behave in the renovated ballroom. She challenged my assumptions. I challenged hers. It was the most professionally exhilarating collaboration I had experienced in a decade of building things, but it was also something else entirely. I began to notice everything about her. The way she always made 2 cups of tea in the morning and brought one to whoever was closest to her when she did it. The way she pressed her fingers to her lips when she was thinking, a small unconscious gesture that I found myself watching for. The way she remembered things people told her in passing, small details about their lives, and asked about them weeks later with genuine interest. She was curious about everything. She asked me questions no one else had ever asked me. She wanted to know why I had become an architect, Not in the polite small talk way, but in the deep way, the way that asked for the real answer. I told her about my grandmother's house in Seville, the one with the courtyard, the way the afternoon light moved through it like something alive. I had never told anyone that story. It had always felt too personal. Too much like handing someone the key to the room where I kept what mattered most. Elena listened in a way that made you feel like you were the only person in the world while you were speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You build the things you are looking for." I did not know what to say to that. She had looked directly into the middle of me and said something true in return. She told me about growing up between two countries, between her mother's Argentina and her father's Spain, always belonging partly to both and entirely to neither, and how that feeling of in-between spaces had made her fall in love with interior design. I wanted to create spaces where people could feel completely at home, she said, because I did not always know how to feel that way myself. Do you feel that way now? I asked. At home somewhere? She looked at me for a long moment. I am beginning to, she said. I told myself that what I was feeling was admiration. Professional admiration, friendship, the natural warmth between two people who work closely and share a passion. For the same things, I told myself this with less and less. Conviction as November became December and the Harmon project consumed our days. And Elena Vasquez became the part of every day I looked forward to. Most thought it was a Thursday in December, almost midnight, when we were the last two people left in the office. The city was frozen outside the windows. We had been working for 14 hours and the blueprint table was covered in sketches and notes and the remains of takeout containers that had been our dinner 3 hours ago. Elena was standing at the window, her shoes off, her jacket draped over a chair, her curly hair loose and slightly wild from the number of times she had pushed her hands through it during the day. She was looking out at the city with a glass of wine from the bottle someone had left in the kitchen. I poured myself a glass and stood beside her. "Do you ever feel afraid of how much you want something?" she asked. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the lights of the city below. My heart did something complicated. "Yes," I said carefully. "What do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly? This." She gestured vaguely at the city, at the office, at everything around us. "This kind of work. This kind of conversation. This kind of..." She paused. "Aliveness. The feeling that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing with exactly the right person." I was not going to ask what she meant by the last part. I was absolutely not going to ask, "Are you happy here?" I asked instead. "In the city. With the work." She turned to look at me then, and the low light of the office made her face softer, made her eyes very dark. And she looked at me for a moment longer than necessary before she said, "I am very happy here." The way she said it made the words feel like they had more than one meaning. I went home that night and stood in my kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. My carefully ordered life felt like it was rearranging itself around something new, something warm and frightening and entirely outside my control. I had been in relationships before. With women, always with women, in a life where that was simply one of the true things about me, as natural and unquestioned as my love of buildings and morning coffee. I had been in 2 serious relationships and several less serious ones, and I knew what it felt like to fall in love. I knew the particular gravity of it. The way it tilted the world. The world was tilting. I sat down in the dark and held my wine glass and let myself, for the first time, think clearly about what I was feeling. I was falling in love with Elena Vasquez. The thought arrived not as a crisis, but as a kind of quiet settling, like something that had been floating finally touching ground. Of course, I was. How could anyone spend this much time with her and not? The question was what to do with it. I did nothing with it. I held it privately, carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you are not yet sure of the right surface to set it on. I continued to work alongside her every day. I continued to laugh at things she said, to argue about design decisions, to bring her the specific kind of dark chocolate she had once mentioned preferring when she was stressed. She continued to bring me tea without being asked, to challenge me in ways that made me better at my work, to look at me sometimes with an expression I could not quite name. January arrived. The Harmon project was reaching its most critical phase. Elena and I were spending entire days on site now, walking through the gutted ballrooms and grand corridors of the old hotel, watching it slowly transform under the hands of construction crews. There is something intimate about a building in progress, something exposed and vulnerable about walls open to show their bones. Elena moved through those spaces like she understood them, running her hand along an old stone pillar, standing at the center of a room and closing her eyes for a moment as if she was listening. "What are you listening for?" I asked her once, in the third-floor gallery where the original plasterwork was being carefully restored. She opened her eyes and looked at me. "The room's intention," she said. "Every space wants to be something. I am trying to hear what this one wants. And what does it want?" She looked around the long room with its tall windows and its flaking gold ceiling. "It wants to be remembered," she said. "It wants people to walk in here and feel the weight of every other person who has ever stood in this room. It wants to be a place that makes people feel the beauty of time." I looked at her instead of the room. "You are extraordinary." "You know," she looked back at me, startled slightly. And then a smile moved across her face that was different from her usual smile, slower, more private. "Sophia," she said, in a voice that was different from her usual voice, and then her phone rang. She looked at the screen and something shifted in her expression. "I have to take this," she said quietly. She walked toward the far end of the gallery, and I stood among the scaffolding and the dust and the light from the tall windows and pressed my hand, fought against a cold stone wall, and breathed. It was Marcus who told me. One afternoon in February over coffee in the atrium. He was not being unkind. He was simply the kind of person who shared information without considering the weight of it. "Did you know Elena was engaged?" "Before she came here?" He was stirring his coffee, looking at the foam. "Some woman in Barcelona. Apparently it ended quite badly. Very sudden. That is partly why she took this posting, from what I understand." I kept my face arranged in something neutral. "I did not know that," I said. "She does not talk about it. I only heard because Adriana in HR mentioned it." He shrugged. "Sad, though. You could see she was the type who would love very deeply." I thought about this for a long time afterward. It explained certain things. The slight guardedness Elena carried in certain moments. The way she sometimes retreated from warmth just when it reached its most genuine point. The way she lived fully in the present, as if she had deliberately decided not to look behind her. I understood this. I had done something similar once after my second serious relationship had ended. You build a wall not to keep people out entirely, but to control the gates. You decide who gets access and in what measure. You protect the most vulnerable parts of yourself not out of cowardice, but out of hard-won wisdom. I wanted to tell her that whatever had happened in Barcelona, she was safe here. I wanted to say it in some way that would not presume too much or ask for anything in return. I did not know how as it happened. She told me herself it was a Saturday and we had been on site together all morning, and she suggested, as she sometimes did, that we walk to the small Italian restaurant 3 blocks from the Harmon that did handmade pasta and played old records. We had gone there 4 times before. It had become, quietly and without anyone naming it as such, a place that belonged to us. We ordered wine and pasta, and the restaurant was quiet in the afternoon, and the light came through the front window at an angle that made everything gold. She told me about Camille. They had been together for 3 years. They had talked about the future in the specific and concrete way that means you believe in it. And then Camille had met someone else, and the relationship had ended in the space of a single devastating conversation, with a swiftness and finality that Elena described as feeling like the ground had simply stopped being there. "The worst part was not losing her," Elena said, looking at her wine glass. "The worst part was that I had given her everything. I had been completely open, completely present, completely trusting. And that openness was the thing that made the loss so total." She looked up. "I have been more careful since then, about letting people all the way in." "That is entirely reasonable," I said gently. "Is it?" She looked at me with an expression I could not read. "Or is it just fear wearing the clothes of wisdom?" The question landed in the middle of the table between us. "Both can be true at once," I said. She nodded slowly. "There is someone," she said then, carefully, "who makes the carefulness very difficult." The restaurant played something slow and soft. Outside the window, people walked past in their winter coats. Who? I asked. The word came out barely above a whisper. She looked at me. The afternoon light was in her eyes. She held my gaze for a long, still moment, and then she said, "You already know." My heart stopped entirely and then started again. Loudly, "Elena," I said. "I know," she said quickly, looking down. "I know it is complicated. We are working together, and I do not want to make anything difficult. And I am aware that I am not the most open person in the world right now. And there is no obligation, absolutely none. For you two, Elena," she stopped talking and looked at me. "I have been in love with you since October," I said. "Since you walked through the lobby in that rust-colored coat and laughed at something the receptionist said. I have been trying to be professional and sensible, and I have been failing at it entirely for 4 months." The silence between us was enormous and warm and full of something, and then she started laughing. Softly, with relief and something like joy. And she pressed her hand over her mouth, and her eyes were bright. And I thought she was the most beautiful person I had ever seen. 4 months, she said through her hand. "Every single day," I said. She reached across the table and took my hand. And I turned mine over and held hers, and we sat like that in the afternoon light while the record played and the pasta cooled. Just holding on, we walked back to the Harmon site afterward because we were still on the clock, technically. And because neither of us quite knew how to transition from the enormity of what had just happened to whatever came next. The air between us was different now, charged with something acknowledged. And I was acutely aware of how close she was as we walked. The brush of her shoulder against mine. Inside the hotel, the construction crews had gone home for the weekend. The building was ours alone, full of the particular silence of a space in transformation. Dust motes hanging in the last of the afternoon light. The smell of stone and new wood and possibility. We walked up to the second floor. To the main salon, which was the furthest along in its renovation. The new floors were in honey-colored oak that caught the light. The tall windows had been restored and they looked out over the city. The plasterwork on the ceiling had been completed that week. And the room had its bones back, its beautiful old bones. And you could begin to imagine what it would become. Elena stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. "This is it," she said softly. "This is what it wanted to be." I stood a few feet away and watched her face. She was entirely present, entirely in the room, and she was happy. I had learned to read her happiness because it was different from her other expressions. It was quieter. It went deeper. She turned and found me watching her. "What?" she said, but she was smiling. "Nothing," I said. "You." She walked toward me slowly, and the distance between us closed. And she stopped when we were very close. Close enough that I could see the small scar above her eyebrow and the specific shade of her eyes in this light, which was not quite brown, but something warmer. Something that reminded me of old honey and afternoon sun. "Sophia," she said softly. "Yes," I said, which was not really an answer to anything she had said, but felt like the right response to everything she meant. She reached up and touched my face with one hand, gently, her fingers against my jaw, and looked at me for a long moment with an expression that was wonder and tenderness and a very careful kind of hope. And then she kissed me. It was soft and slow and entirely certain. The kind of kiss that has been decided and not improvised. And I felt it all the way through my chest. A warmth that spread outward from the center of me. I put my hand against her back and kissed her back with everything I had been carrying for 4 months. And she made a small sound against my mouth that was half surprise and half something like relief. When we finally pulled back and looked at each other, we were both breathing a little differently than usual. "That," she said carefully, "was not nothing." "No," I agreed. "That was absolutely not nothing." She laughed. And I laughed, and we stood in the beautiful, unfinished room with the honey-colored floors and the faucet afternoon dying in the windows and held each other. In the easy, natural way of people who have been waiting to do exactly this. We did not rush. This was partly because we were both people who had been hurt in different ways and at different depths, and we had both learned the cost of going too fast towards something you wanted too much. But it was also because we were genuinely interested in the slow version and the dailiness of getting to know someone, in the accumulation of small things. We had dinners together that went until midnight. We walked through the city on weekends, discovering neighborhoods we had not yet explored. arguing amiably about whether the 19th century apartment buildings on certain streets were beautiful or oppressive, and generally concluding that they were both. We visited museums and galleries and made each other explain our reactions to the things we saw, which was the best way either of us had found to understand how another person's mind worked. She came to my apartment for the first time on a Sunday in March. She stood in the doorway and looked around slowly, and I watched her do it the way you watch someone read something you have written, aware of your own vulnerability and the exposure. My apartment was very much me. Clean lines and warm materials, a drafting table by the window, books everywhere, a kitchen that was clearly used and loved, one wall entirely of south-facing windows. "It is exactly you," she said finally, with great satisfaction. "Is that good?" She turned and looked at me. "It is exactly you," she said again. Of course it is good. I had never particularly thought of myself as someone who needed to be seen. I had lived inside my own self-sufficiency for long enough that I had stopped noticing the loneliness of it. But something about the way Elena looked at me and at the things I loved and at the spaces I created made me understand that I had been seen only partially before, that she was looking at the whole thing. She cooked for me in my kitchen that Sunday, and I sat at the counter and watched, and we talked about everything and nothing. The easy conversation of two people who have found their frequency and can stay on it for hours without effort. She made arroz con leche because it was what her mother made on cold days, and the temperature had dropped overnight and it felt right. My apartment smelled of cinnamon and warm sugar. The city was quiet outside. After dinner we sat on the couch and she put her head on my shoulder and I put my arm around her, and we did not talk for a while. Just breathed in the same rhythm in the same room. And it was one of the best hours I had experienced in years. "I feel safe with you," she said quietly into the room. Not to me particularly, just to the air. I held her a little tighter. "Good," I said. "That is exactly right." There was a night in April when Elena was quieter than usual. We had been to a dinner party at a colleague's house, and she'd been fine throughout. Present and warm and funny, but on the walk home there was something pulled inward about her. Some weight she was carrying that she had not been carrying when we arrived. I did not press. I had learned that she needed to arrive at things in her own time. I walked beside her through the April streets, our shoulders touching. The city soft around us in the spring dark. When we got to her apartment, she unlocked the door and stood in the threshold and then turned and looked at me. "Will you come in?" she said. "I need to tell you something." We sat on her couch and she held her hands in our lap and stared at them for a moment. Her apartment was full of beautiful things, things she had gathered from the various cities she had lived in, each one a small story. I had learned to love the room the way I had learned to love her, through accumulated attention. "My ex was at that dinner," she said. "Not Camille. Someone else. Someone I was with briefly here before you." She paused. "It ended badly because I ended it. Because I realized fairly quickly that I was keeping myself at a distance from her in a way that was not fair to her. I was going through the motions of a relationship without giving her anything real." She looked up at me. "And the reason I was keeping my distance was because I was already, without quite realizing it, falling in love with you." I was quiet for a moment. "Elena," I said, "I am telling you this because I want you to know that what I feel for you is not something that crept up on me accidentally. It is something I recognized and chose again, even when I was afraid of it." She looked at me steadily. "You deserve to know that you were not second. You were not what I settled on after something else did not work. You were the thing I was moving toward from the beginning." I reached over and took her hand. She was trembling slightly, just slightly, the small trembling of someone who has been honest and is waiting to see if honesty was safe. "Elena," I said again, gently. "I know." She blinked. "You know?" "I know who you are. I have been watching you be exactly who you are for 6 months. I know that you do not do things carelessly. I know that when you give something, you give it completely." I squeezed her hand. "I am not afraid. Not of who you are or what you have been through or how carefully you have loved before. I am not going anywhere." She looked at me for a long time. Then she brought my hand up and held it against her chest, against her heart, which was beating hard and fast. "I love you," she said. I have been not saying it for weeks because it felt too enormous, and I did not want to frighten you or presume or move. Too fast, and I have been carrying it around like a stone in my pocket. I leaned forward and kissed her very softly. I love you, I said against her mouth. I have also been carrying it. We have been carrying the same stone. She laughed weakly, because she was crying slightly, and pulled back and pressed her forehead against mine. And we sat like that, foreheads together, laughing and breathing. In the beautiful room full of beautiful things she had gathered from around the world, we told people gradually. The way you tell people things that matter to you, carefully and selectively at first. And then more broadly as the telling became easier and the reality of us became more solid and certain. Our colleagues were largely unsurprised. Marcus told me that everyone had known for months, which was mortifying and also somehow gratifying. What I had not expected about loving Elena was how practical it would be. How full of small decisions and accommodations and negotiations. Not the difficult kind, but the good kind, the kind that means you are building something real. We were both independent, both stubborn in specific ways, both in possession of strong aesthetic and professional opinions that did not always align. This could have been a problem. It was instead one of the best things about us. We fought sometimes. Not often and never cruelly, but with the honest directness of two people who respected each other enough to say true things. Our arguments were almost always about work, which was both convenient and revealing. We would disagree and disagree loudly, and eventually one of us would see the other's point, or we would find a third position that was better than either of our originals. Afterward, we would sit somewhere and talk it through and usually conclude that we had both been right about different parts of it. She taught me things. How to stop and be still in the middle of a project, to feel what a space was asking for instead of imposing a solution on it. How to cook arroz con leche and 2 other dishes from her mother's repertoire. How to travel more slowly, to spend 3 days in a city instead of 1 and see it properly instead of collecting it like a trophy. How to let go of the control I had always thought was necessary, and discover that some of the best things were not the things you planned. I taught her things too. How to read a structural drawing. How to walk through a building and feel its load paths. Where the weight went and why, how form and structure were always a conversation. How to be still in a different way, the way of someone alone in an apartment who has made their peace with silence. How to trust that being known completely was not a vulnerability but a gift we began to make. A life together with the unhurried deliberateness of 2 architects who understood that good. Structures were not rushed. The Harmon opened in June. 10 months after Elena had first walked through the lobby of our offices shaking rain from her umbrella. There was a gala opening, and the building was full of people who moved through the grand spaces and looked up at the restored ceilings, and ran their hands along the old stone pillars with wonder on their faces. Elena and I stood together in the 2nd floor salon, the room where we had first kissed, and watched people discover what we had built together. The honey-colored floors, the tall restored windows, the plasterwork ceiling catching the light of 100 candles. The room was exactly what it had wanted to be, a space that held memory and welcomed the present, that made you feel the weight of time and the possibility of now. She slipped her hand into mine. I looked at her in profile, her dark curly hair up for the occasion. Her dress the deep blue of the Barcelona sky she had described to me once, a night ocean blue. And she was looking at the room with the particular expression she got when something was exactly right. The quiet, deep satisfaction of a person whose work was true. She turned and found me looking. "Stop," she said. Smiling. "No," I said. She turned fully toward me and put both her hands against my chest, lightly, and looked up at me with that expression that was still, after almost a year, capable of stopping my heart. "We did something beautiful," she said. "We did," I agreed. "The building. I mean," she said, with a slight smile that meant she also did not only mean the building. "I know what you meant," I said. Around us the room filled with music and light and the voices of people in a beautiful space on a summer evening. And she rose onto her toes and kissed me softly, briefly, in the room we had made together. And I put my arms around her and held on. She asked me in the most unexpected way, which was entirely characteristic of her. Because Elena Vasquez had a genius for the unexpected that I had stopped being surprised by without ever stopping being delighted. It was September on a Saturday morning. We were in bed in my apartment, which had quietly become our apartment over the preceding months in the way of apartments, when 2 people stopped bothering to maintain separate spaces. She was reading. I was pretending to read but was actually watching the light on the ceiling that came through the window and thinking about a project, and also about nothing in particular, which was a luxury I had not been able to indulge before she taught me how. She turned a page. Then another. Then she put her book face down on her chest and said, without looking at me, I do not want to live anywhere else. The apartment? I said. The city, she said. My life, you. She turned her head and looked at me then. Morning light. Her face unguarded and certain. I do not want this to be a chapter, she said. I want this to be the whole book. My heart was doing something enormous and quiet. What are you asking me? I said, which was not exactly the right question because I knew precisely what she was asking, but wanted to hear it said. She rolled onto her side to face me and propped her head on her hand and looked at me with the steady brown eyes that I knew now as well as I knew anything. Better than most things. Sophia Reyes, she said, you are the most infuriating, brilliant, quietly passionate, entirely necessary person I have ever known. You build things I could spend my life looking at. You argue with me in the specific way that makes every argument worth having. You know how to be quiet with me, which is the thing I have always needed most and found least. She paused. I love you beyond my ability to measure it. I want to wake up next to you and argue with you about buildings and cook for you on cold days and grow old looking at things you have made. She reached over to her side of the bed and picked up the small object she had, apparently placed on the nightstand without my noticing, which was extremely typical of her, and held it out to me. It was a small ring, simple and beautiful. A single thin band of warm gold with a tiny architectural drawing on the inside, which I would later discover was my grandmother's courtyard in Seville, because she had found a photograph of it in a book and had taken it to a jeweler and asked them to render it in gold on the inside of a band, which was the most Elena thing that anyone had ever done. Marry me, she said simply. I was crying, which I had not particularly expected. I pressed the back of my hand to my face and laughed at myself for crying. And she smiled that slow sunrise smile, and I said, because there was never going to be any other answer to this question. Said with my whole voice and my whole heart, yes, absolutely yes. Without any question, yes. She slid the ring onto my finger and I pulled her to me and we held each other in the morning light, laughing and crying slightly, which is the correct response to the best moments. And outside the window the city went about its September business, entirely unaware that everything that mattered had just been decided in a small apartment on the 14th floor. We were married the following June, exactly 1 year after the Harmon had opened, in the garden of a small house outside the city that belonged to Elena's aunt. The garden had a courtyard, which was not a coincidence. Elena had found it for exactly this reason. Her family came from Argentina and Spain, filling the house with accents and noise and the particular warmth of a family that expressed love through food and volume and showing up with too much of everything. My family was smaller and quieter, my mother, my brother, and a scattering of cousins. But they were absorbed immediately into the larger warmth of Elena's people. And by the evening my mother and Elena's mother were sitting together at a table sharing photographs of us as children with the proprietary delight of two women who feel they have made something work. We were married in the late afternoon, when the light was gold and the garden smelled of jasmine. Marcus cried. Elena's cousin played guitar. Our colleague Adriana from HR, who had apparently been following our story since the beginning with the passionate interest of someone reading their favorite novel, sobbed audibly from the second row and was not remotely embarrassed about it. Elena wore white with embroidery at the edges that echoed the plasterwork patterns of the Harmon ballroom. I wore something deep green that she had chosen because she said it was the color of the building materials she loved best. And this was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, while also being entirely about architecture, which was extremely on brand for both of us. We wrote our own vows. Mine were about light, about how she'd walked into my carefully ordered life and reoriented it the way a south-facing window reorients a room, not by disrupting its structure, but by illuminating it. About how she had taught me that the best spaces were not the controlled ones, but the ones that allowed for surprise, for the unexpected quality of light, for the way a room could become more than you planned if you listened to what it wanted to be. About how I wanted to spend my life being illuminated by her, Hers were about foundations. About how every building that lasts is built on something honest, something that does not try to be more than it is, something true to its own nature and to the earth it stands on. About how she had spent years building on insufficient foundations, leaning on surfaces that could not hold the weight she gave them, and about how I was the first person who felt like bedrock. About how she wanted to build everything that remained of her life on the foundation of being loved by me, and loving me in return. There was not a dry eye in the garden. We danced until midnight. And then until 2 in the morning, and then until the stars were fading and the birds were starting in the trees. And no one wanted to stop because stopping would mean the night was over. And the night was too beautiful to end. We bought a house the following year, which was predictably the most complicated thing 2 architects had ever attempted. We argued about every room. We had long, serious, passionate disagreements about load-bearing, walls and sightlines and the placement of windows and the sacred question of the kitchen. We drew up plans and revised them and argued about the revisions and drew up new plans. Our contractor, a patient man named George who had worked with difficult clients for 30 years, told us quietly at one point that we were the most exhausting and also the most impressive clients he had ever worked with. And we took this as high praise. The house we ended up with was genuinely extraordinary. It had a courtyard at its center, naturally, with light that moved through it in the afternoon like something alive. It had a studio where we could both work at large tables by windows that looked into the garden. It had a kitchen that Elena used the way she used everything, with total commitment and genuine joy. It had rooms that felt like themselves, that did not apologize for what they were, that welcomed you and held you and let you go. We filled it with the things we had gathered separately, and the things we gathered together. Books and drawings and objects from the cities we visited on the slow vacations Elena had taught me to take. A photograph of my grandmother's courtyard in Seville. A textile from Buenos Aires that had been in Elena's family for 3 generations. A small stone from the Harmon site which I had picked up during construction and kept without knowing exactly why. Knowing only that it felt like the beginning of something. We worked together still on and off when projects called for it. We had learned that we were better at collaboration than most people who loved each other. Possibly because we had started as collaborators and built love on top of that foundation. So the professional and the personal were always braided together, always informed by each other. People watched us work and sometimes commented on the particular quality of attention we gave each other. The way we listened and pushed back and gave ground and found new positions. The ease of 2 people who had been having the best conversation of their lives for years in quiet moments. In the evenings when the house was still and the light was low and Elena was reading. On the couch with her feet tucked under her and I was at the drafting table or beside her with my own book. I would sometimes look up and look at her and feel the full weight of what we had made together, not just the house or the work, but the whole thing, the life she would sometimes sense me looking and turn without lifting her eyes from her page and say what? Nothing I would say. Sophia, you I would say she would go back to her book. Hiding a smile, the years moved through us the way light moves through a building differently and different. Seasons always changing, always revealing something new. We had our hard times. Because that is what years do. There were periods of work stress so intense that we barely saw each other and had to consciously, deliberately choose to find our way back to each other at the end of the tunnel. There were losses. Elena's father, who had been a warm and funny man who had approved of me immediately and taught me to make his specific version of empanadas, which I attempted to keep alive in our kitchen with only partial success. A close friend of mine who died too young from an illness that arrived and took her before any of us had time to accept it was real. In the hard times, Elena was the thing I came back to. Not as an escape, but as a foundation, as the place from which I could feel everything that needed to be felt without losing myself in it. She held space for my grief without trying to fix it or speed it through. She knew when to sit in silence with me and when to pull me gently toward the present, toward food and light and the ordinary miraculous fact of being alive in a house we loved, and I held space for hers. For the grief over her father that came in unexpected waves for years afterward, the anniversaries and the ordinary moments that ambushed her. For the professional disappointments and the creative frustrations. For the days when her beautiful mind was in conflict with itself and she could not find her way to the work. I had learned from her how to be still with someone, how to witness without interrupting. How to love without the impulse to solve. We grew into each other over the years the way buildings grow into their sites. Settling, adjusting, finding the accommodation between form and ground that makes something stand. We became more ourselves in each other's company, not less. She made me braver, more willing to trust the unplanned thing, more open to surprise. I made her more anchored, more willing to trust that roots did not mean restriction. Our professional reputations grew individually and together. We were interviewed once, together, for an architecture journal. And the interviewer asked us what it was like to be both a creative partnership and a romantic one. And whether the two ever conflicted. Elena answered before I did. They do not conflict, she said. They are the same thing. The qualities you need to build something beautiful with another person are the same. Qualities you need to build a life with them. You have to listen more than you talk. You have to be honest when something is not working. You have to be willing to tear down and rebuild when the first version is not the true version. And you have to trust that the foundation is solid enough to support everything you put on top of it. The interviewer looked at me. What she said, I said. Elena pressed her foot against mine under the table. Which was what she did when she was pleased. On our 20th anniversary, we went back to the Harmon Hotel. It had changed over the years, as buildings do, as all living things do. There had been renovations and updates and the inevitable drift of style and function. But the bones were still there. The stone pillars. The tall windows. The plasterwork ceiling in the second floor. Salon that had been restored so carefully in that first winter of the project. We stood in the center of the salon, which was set up for a private event that evening. Tables gleaming in candles not yet lit in the afternoon light. We were older. My hair had silver in it now, and Elena's curls had deepened from dark brown to something almost black at the roots and warm brown at the edges. We had the faces of people who had laughed a great deal and felt things deeply and spent time in the sun. We had the hands of people who had built things. She stood where she had stood 20 years ago, in almost exactly the same spot, and turned slowly, taking the room in the way she always did, listening for what it wanted to be. It is still itself, she said, with great satisfaction. The good ones always are, I said. She turned and found me watching her. As I always did. Stop, she said. No, I said. She walked toward me slowly. The way she always walked toward me, with that particular quality of arrival that made me feel, every single time, that she was choosing me again. Deliberately and fully, which was the thing she had told me she did every day, and which I believed entirely because I felt it. She put her hands against my chest, the way she had done 20 years ago in this room. I put my arms around her. The afternoon light came through the tall windows at an angle I knew, had always known. The specific angle of late afternoon in early summer that we had argued about in blueprints and fallen into together and would know for the rest of our lives. Sophia, she said softly. Yes, I said, which was still the right answer to everything. She kissed me in the room we had built together, in the building that was still itself, in the afternoon light that did not know or care that it was falling on two women who had found each other by the unreasonable grace of the right project at the right moment, who had built a life out of conversation and attention and the deep, uncomplicated truth of being exactly right for each other. Outside, the city went on being the city. The years went on being years. The light moved as light always moves, following its old and faithful path across the floor, touching everything equally, asking nothing, giving everything. We were still there. We were still exactly there. We were home. There is a courtyard in the center of our house. On summer evenings, when the work is done and the day is settling, we sit in it. The light comes through at an angle that changes with the season. The jasmine climbs the south wall. There is a table and 2 chairs and sometimes wine and sometimes just the late air. We do not always talk. Sometimes we simply sit together in the space we made, in the life we built, in the quiet that belongs to people who have been loving each other for long enough that silence is not absence but presence, not emptiness but fullness. Not an end, but a kind of rest between sentences and the longest and best conversation of both our lives. She will look at me, sometimes across the table, in the light with those brown eyes that still know how to stop my heart. And she will smile slowly in the way that belongs only to private moments, the smile that is not for anyone else. And I will think, as I have thought 1,000 times, that this is the most beautiful space I have ever been in, not the courtyard, Not the house taught this. Her us taught the architecture of a love that was built to last.